In 1962, a city beyond the Arctic Circle ran out of bread, and no one in Moscow noticed for weeks. The trains still arrived on time. The smokestacks still poured gray into a gray sky. The radio still spoke of progress and unity and the unstoppable momentum of history. But inside kitchens where frost crawled along the walls, families broke their loaves into thinner and thinner slices, pretending the shortage was temporary, pretending it was normal, pretending it wasn't happening at all. That city was not meant to fail. None of them were. The Soviet Union built cities the way other countries built weapons, with urgency, scale, and an absolute belief that intention alone could overpower reality. Entire populations were relocated to tundra, taiga, desert, and steppe. Streets were laid out before people arrived. Apartment blocks rose before trees. Factories began operating before the first schools opened. These were not towns that grew slowly around rivers or markets. They were declarations stamped into the earth. And when one of those declarations faltered, when a factory slowed, or a mine flooded, or a shipment stopped arriving, something strange happened. The city did not bend, it did not adapt, it did not shrink and then recover. It simply began to die, quietly, mechanically, one failure triggering another, until the place itself seemed to forget why it existed. The mystery is not that Soviet cities failed. The mystery is why, once they did, they could almost never come back. To understand that, you have to start with how they were born.
Most Soviet cities were not cities in the traditional sense. They were instruments. Their purpose was singular and explicit. Extract this mineral, refine this metal, assemble this machine, guard this border. Everything else was secondary, including the lives of the people who lived there. Housing, schools, hospitals, theaters, even grocery stores existed to support the main function, not to form a resilient community. In places like Norilsk, the ground itself resisted settlement. Permafrost cracked foundations, winter lasted 10 months, the air carried sulfur and metal dust. Yet tens of thousands were sent there because nickel was needed, and the plan said it could be done. It did not matter that traditional urban logic would have placed a city somewhere else. The Soviet system believed geography could be disciplined. This belief shaped everything. The economy was not built around consumers, but around quotas. A city's survival depended not on demand or innovation, but on whether it fulfilled a numerical target set hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. If the target was met, supplies flowed. If it wasn't, explanations were demanded. If explanations failed, people were punished.
The city itself had no agency. It could not diversify. It could not pivot. It could not attract new industries or new residents organically. It could only perform its assigned role or suffer the consequences. For a time, this rigidity was disguised as strength. The Soviet Union could mobilize resources at an astonishing scale. Entire cities appeared in a decade. Rail lines cut through wilderness. Apartment blocks housed thousands with identical efficiency. From the outside, it looked like order, but beneath that order was fragility. Every Soviet city functioned like a single component machine. Remove the component, and nothing else worked. The factory was not just an employer. It powered the heating system. It maintained the roads. It supplied the kindergartens. It controlled the buses. It determined whether meat arrived in the shops or not. In many cities, the local government was little more than an administrative shadow of the main enterprise. Decisions were made not by mayors, but by plant directors, who answered upward to ministries, not outward to residents. If the factory slowed, the city froze, literally. In the winter of 1988, residents of Vorkuta remember their radiators cooling before the news reached them. The coal output had dipped below plan, maintenance crews were reassigned, fuel deliveries were delayed, pipes burst in apartment stairwells. People slept in coats, boiling water on gas stoves to keep infants warm. Officially,
Everything was under control. The system could absorb many kinds of stress. What it could not absorb was failure that persisted. When a Soviet city missed its targets once, it was a problem. When it missed them twice, it was a warning. When it missed them 3 times, it became a liability. Plans were rewritten, investments redirected, promises quietly withdrawn. The city remained on the map, but in the logic of the system, it had already begun to vanish. This is where the first irreversible break occurred. In a market economy, a struggling city might attract cheaper labor, new businesses, or alternative industries. In the Soviet economy, scarcity did not attract opportunity, it attracted suspicion. A failing city was not seen as a place that needed help, it was seen as evidence of mismanagement, ideological weakness, or sabotage. So resources went elsewhere. What followed was not collapse, but erosion. Stores that once stocked meat weekly now did so monthly. Replacement parts took longer to arrive. Young specialists stopped being assigned there. Cultural programs were canceled. The cinema closed on weekdays, then permanently. The city still existed, but it was slowly being disconnected from the network that sustained it. People felt this before they understood it. A teacher in a planned city outside Magnitogorsk recalled the moment she realized something fundamental had changed. The chalk ran out. Not temporarily, not for a week, for months. Requests went unanswered. Lessons were improvised. Children wrote on scraps of newspaper. This was not dramatic. There were no announcements, just absence. Absence was the language of decline. Soviet cities had been built without redundancy. There were no parallel supply chains, no private alternatives, no informal markets that could legally fill gaps. When the official channel failed, nothing replaced it. People improvised quietly, trading favors, hoarding materials, cannibalizing broken equipment to keep something else running. These tactics kept individuals alive, but they hollowed out institutions. And once institutions weakened, recovery became almost impossible. Housing deteriorated quickly. Soviet apartment blocks were designed for speed, not longevity. Maintenance schedules assumed a functioning state apparatus. When funding slowed, roofs leaked, elevators broke and stayed broken, mold spread behind wallpaper. Families adapted, but buildings did not. Infrastructure failures compounded each other. A broken pump flooded basements, damaging electrical systems. Power outages shut down water treatment. Roads cracked and were never resurfaced, slowing deliveries further. Each failure made the next more likely. Yet people stayed, not because life was good, but because leaving was hard. Soviet citizens were tied to their cities through residence permits, employment assignments, and housing allocations. Moving was not simply a personal choice. It required approvals, connections, and often luck. For older residents, it was almost impossible. Their entire lives were embedded in a place that no longer worked, but would not let them go. So the city aged. Young people, when they could, left first. They studied elsewhere and never returned. Military service became an escape route. Marriage to someone from another city became a strategy. What remained was an increasingly elderly population, less mobile, more dependent on services that were steadily degrading. This demographic shift sealed the city's fate. A city with fewer young workers produced less. A city that produced less received fewer resources. A city that received fewer resources lost more young people. The loop tightened, quietly, efficiently. And then the larger failure came. When the Soviet Union itself began to unravel, the cities that were already weak did not fall. They were simply unclogged. The transition of the early 1990s is often described as chaotic, but for many single-industry Soviet cities, it felt eerily calm. The ministries vanished. The plans stopped arriving. The factories were privatized, abandoned, or stripped for parts. The state that had created these cities withdrew without dismantling them. In places like Kazakh, this withdrawal happened almost overnight. The mine closed after an accident. The electricity was cut. The heating stopped. Residents were told they would be relocated. Some were, many were not. They left when they could, carrying doors, radiators, anything that could be traded elsewhere. What remained were buildings that could not be reused. Unlike older cities with mixed-use structures, Soviet-planned cities were monolithic. Residential blocks were interchangeable and contextless. Industrial zones were toxic and specialized. There was no historic center to attract tourism, no small-scale commerce infrastructure to seed a new economy. The city could not reinvent itself because it had never been allowed to be anything else. Even when there was an attempt at revival, the results were limited. In the late 1990s, regional governments tried to save certain cities by rebranding them, offering tax incentives or attracting new investors. But investors looked at the same things residents saw: distance, decay, a workforce trained for one vanished purpose, an infrastructure designed around a single employer that no longer existed. The cost of adaptation was always higher than the cost of starting fresh somewhere else. And so these cities lingered in a strange state between life and death. They are not ruins in the romantic sense, they are inhabited. Children still walk to school past empty factories. Pensioners tend small gardens beside collapsing apartment blocks. The radio still plays. Buses still run, sometimes, but the future has been canceled. This is why recovery after a single failure was so rare. The Soviet system did not produce resilient cities, it produced optimized ones. Optimization maximizes efficiency under expected conditions, but it collapses under deviation. There was no margin for error, no capacity for local experimentation, no permission to fail safely. When failure occurred, it propagated through every layer of urban life.
And because the city had been designed as a function, not a community, once that function failed, there was nothing left to reorganize around. The most haunting aspect is how ordinary this all felt to the people living through it. There were no dramatic finales, no official declarations that a city was finished, just a gradual narrowing of possibility. Fewer choices, fewer services, fewer reasons to stay, until staying itself became an act of endurance rather than belonging. In interviews conducted decades later, former residents rarely speak of anger first. They speak of confusion, of waiting, of assuming things would return to normal because they always had before. The system had trained them to believe that continuity was guaranteed. It wasn't. By the time that became clear, it was already too late. The city beyond the Arctic Circle never recovered its bread supply. The factory resumed partial operations years later, but the population had halved. Schools merged, hospitals closed wings. What had once been a strategic node became a logistical afterthought. On paper, the city still exists. In reality, it lives in a long aftermath, suspended between the ambition that created it and the failure that revealed its limits. This is not just a story about the Soviet Union. It is a story about what happens when cities are built to serve systems instead of people, when efficiency replaces adaptability, and when failure is treated as a moral flaw rather than a condition to be planned for. The Soviet experiment proved that you can move mountains, reroute rivers, and raise cities from nothing. It also proved that if those cities are not allowed to grow roots of their own, a single break can be enough to undo them forever. And for the people who remained, standing in places that no longer knew what they were for, the question was never why the city failed. It was why it had been built in a way that made failure final. That finality shaped not just landscapes, but identities. For those who stayed, life became a negotiation with diminished expectations. A former engineer in Inta described how he learned to measure time not in years, but in closures. The year the sports hall shut its doors. The winter the last bookstore emptied its shelves. The spring when the hospital stopped accepting new equipment because there was no one left trained to use it. None of these moments felt decisive on their own. Together, they formed a quiet calendar of retreat. What made this retreat irreversible was not simply economic collapse, but institutional memory. Soviet cities did not accumulate local knowledge about survival independent of the state. They had never needed to. Every problem had once been someone else's responsibility, higher up, elsewhere. When that chain of responsibility broke, there was no shared blueprint for improvisation at scale. People adapted individually. Cities did not. In many post-Soviet towns, informal economies emerged to fill gaps, but these were survival mechanisms, not engines of renewal. Scrap metal was stripped from abandoned factories and sold off, reducing any chance those sites could be reused. Forests near cities were cut for firewood, accelerating environmental damage. Apartments were subdivided or abandoned entirely, destabilizing already fragile buildings. Each adaptation solved an immediate problem while worsening the long-term one. There is a temptation to see this as inevitable, as the unavoidable consequence of geography or climate. But geography alone does not doom cities. Around the world, harsh environments host thriving urban centers. The difference lies in flexibility. Soviet cities were frozen not just by cold, but by design.
Their planners assumed permanence. A mine would always operate. A factory would always be needed. The plan extended decades into the future with an almost utopian confidence. Because of that confidence, exit strategies were never developed. There was no plan for decline, no mechanism for graceful contraction. In older urban traditions, decline is absorbed gradually. Neighborhoods change, buildings are repurposed, populations shift but do not vanish. In Soviet-planned cities, there were no neighborhoods in the organic sense, only zones. No small-scale ownership that could reimagine space. Everything belonged to the same absent owner. When that owner disappeared, the vacuum was total. Attempts to inject market logic into these places often failed for the same reason. Markets require choice, competition, and diversity. A city built around one employer, one skill set, and one supply chain cannot suddenly behave like a marketplace. Workers trained to operate specific machinery could not easily retrain without institutions to support them. Those institutions had already eroded.
Even when retraining programs existed, they often prepared people for jobs that did not exist locally. The result was predictable. The most capable left, the least mobile stayed. This selective migration altered the social fabric in ways that compounded decline. Schools lost students and funding simultaneously. Cultural life thinned. Informal social control weakened as communities shrank and aged. Alcoholism and depression increased, not as causes but as symptoms of a future that had narrowed to almost nothing. One resident of Anadyr recalled how the city felt louder after people left. Fewer voices meant every argument echoed longer. Every emergency felt bigger because there were fewer hands to respond. Silence itself became a kind of pressure. Yet from the outside, these cities remained strangely invisible. They were not dramatic enough to draw attention, not catastrophic enough to provoke intervention. They existed in a gray zone of neglect, sustained just enough to avoid disaster, but never enough to allow rebirth. This invisibility was itself a legacy of Soviet planning. Cities were never meant to tell their own stories. They were meant to fulfill roles within a larger narrative of progress. Once that narrative collapsed, the cities lost not only material support, but meaning. Residents often spoke of feeling forgotten rather than abandoned. Forgotten implies that no one is actively choosing neglect. It suggests absence rather than hostility. That perception mattered because it shaped how people related to the state that replaced the Soviet Union. Trust did not disappear overnight. It eroded in the same incremental way as everything else. In some places, disaster forced action. When a pipeline failed or a dam cracked, emergency funds arrived. Buildings were repaired. Sometimes entire neighborhoods were relocated. But these interventions addressed symptoms, not structure. They stabilized the present without rebuilding the future. And without a future, recovery remained theoretical.
What distinguishes Soviet city failure from urban decline elsewhere is the speed with which potential evaporated. In many declining industrial cities around the world, downturns unfold over generations. New identities form slowly. In Soviet cities, decline compressed into years, sometimes months. The shock overwhelmed local capacity to respond. This compression left little room for narrative reframing. People could not tell themselves a story in which the city would become something else. They had never been invited to imagine it as anything but what it was.
Even today, decades later, that imaginative constraint lingers. You can hear it in how former residents speak about their hometowns. They describe what the city was, not what it might be. The mine, the plant, the regiment. When asked what could have saved it, they struggle to answer. Not because they lack ideas, but because the idea that salvation could come from within was never cultivated. The city was always an object of policy, never a subject. This is perhaps the most enduring consequence of Soviet urban failure. Not abandoned buildings or shrinking populations, but a learned helplessness embedded in place. A sense that history happens elsewhere and cities merely endure its outcomes. There are exceptions, of course. A handful of former Soviet cities managed partial recoveries by exploiting unique advantages. Border locations, rare resources, or proximity to major transport corridors provided lifelines. But even these successes were fragile, contingent on external demand rather than internal resilience. And for every exception, there are dozens of towns where time appears stalled.
Walking through such a place, one does not feel the drama of collapse so much as the weight of suspension. Buildings are maintained just enough to remain habitable. Streets are cleared but not improved. Lives continue but without accumulation. Nothing builds on itself. This condition is not accidental. It is the logical endpoint of a system that valued output over adaptability. The Soviet Union excelled at mobilization. It could concentrate labor and resources with astonishing speed. But mobilization is not sustainability. Once the initial momentum faded, there was nothing to replace it. Cities, like ecosystems, require diversity to survive shocks. They need multiple ways of making a living, multiple identities, multiple futures. Soviet cities were monocultures, efficient, impressive, and fatally vulnerable. When the first failure occurred, it exposed that vulnerability. When the second followed, recovery was already out of reach.
For the people who lived there, the tragedy was not just economic, it was existential. A city that cannot recover teaches its residents that effort does not matter, that loyalty is not rewarded, that endurance is the only virtue left. Over time, this lesson reshapes behavior, aspirations, even language. Hope becomes cautious, plans become short-term, risk becomes irrational. And so the city persists, diminished but not erased, carrying forward a lesson written into its streets and buildings. That lesson is not that planning is futile or that ambition is dangerous. It is that systems built without tolerance for failure turn failure into extinction. The Soviet cities that could never recover after one failure are not anomalies. They are case studies in what happens when resilience is sacrificed for control, when places are designed to obey rather than adapt. Their quiet persistence is a warning, still unfolding, about the costs of building cities that cannot imagine their own survival.